So good evening, everyone. I think all of us are looking forward to this roundtable discussion that we are having, and a very timely discussion that we are having on the return of Taliban and its geopolitical fallouts. So first, I would like to welcome His Highness Shri Arvind Singh Mewar of Udaipur, who has very kindly agreed to give the inaugural speech to for this event. So I would like to welcome you, sir. You can give your speech and then we'll start the proceedings of the day. He had just joined. I saw him.
Yeah, we have a message, Namrata, from the palace. You can.
So should I just read that? Because I thought he has
Yes,
joined us.
yes. Okay.
Okay. So we have a message from the palace. And of course, the first thing that he does is to congratulate the Usanas Foundation for taking this initiative and organizing this timely event. And he would like to thank all the panelists who are here to talk about this extremely critical and sensitive subject. He has a couple of questions which he, would be very happy if the panelists would eventually, in their talk, address today. The first he says is the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan has significant ramifications for South Asia, but especially for India, which has serious stakes in the country as its neighbor and the fifth largest aid donor. With the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, an intense debate has broken out in the strategic community on whether India should diplomatically engage with the Taliban. It is clear that India will have to rework its engagement strategy in Afghanistan and focus on protecting its critical investments in the country. His Highness would be very grateful if the panelists would, focus a little on this aspect when they start with their speeches. And he's also very thankful to Usanas Foundation for having him send a message for this webinar. So I think with thanks to His Highness, we can start the proceedings of the day. I would like to welcome our first speaker, Ambassador Anil, who would, start the start the program. And there's a slight change in the program as Miss Meena has to leave a little early. We would, change the sequence of the speakers a little bit. So now I would welcome you, sir. Please start the proceedings for the day.
Good evening and a very warm welcome to all our esteemed panelists and the guests today. On behalf of the Usanas Foundation, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you and express our gratitude for you to joining us. Afghanistan has kept us all busy in recent times. I think all of us have been engaged with what kind of developments will happen there, what kind of Afghanistan will develop, how Taliban will behave, and how the geopolitics of it all will play out eventually as the Americans hastily retreat. And what will be India's role and whether India has a role, how will it catch up? And for all these questions today, we have a very strong panel of finest possible experts, I think, to dwell upon these issues. Of course, there is a lot of crystal gazing always, but then you can always try to put two and two together. And that's what we will try to do. I know I was asked to speak a bit about what kind of a geopolitics we are going to see here when we witness the US exit. So in about 8-10 minutes that has been allotted to me, I will just try to briefly talk about several other countries in the region. I'll not talk about Pakistan. I'll not talk about India because we have real experts there. But let me talk a bit about West Asia in the sense how these countries are going to play, how Russia and China are going to evolve their policies, which are already at variance with the rest of the other countries. We have just seen once again this evening at the United Nations Security Council that Russia and China have had a different take. They even abstained on the UN Security Council Resolution 2593. Fortunately, this was India's contribution, fourth statement on Afghanistan signed or issued during India's presidency of the UN Security Council. This was not envisaged in the beginning. I mean, you can see how quickly the things have evolved. Afghanistan was nowhere there when India started its presidency. And everybody knew that it's going to move out, but the way the things moved really surprised everyone, I would say. So we are all aware that geopolitics is hardly ever so linear and is more like the Russian Matrushka dolls, one inside the other, which some might even construe as the concentric circle approach that we see in the foreign policy, or in the way the players in any given scenario play it out. Afghanistan, unfortunately, has become a fit candidate for possible collaboration among various powers as far as fallout of terrorism and extremism is concerned, and a green field of competition as far as geopolitics and economics are concerned. So we have seen it in this. What happened at the UN also reflects clearly the dichotomy and the paradox that prevails. So more importantly, we have to see how the respective outreaches by the competing powers, including the US, do indicate a paradigm shift. There has been an irony and a paradox in the approaches of many countries. While they hated the American guts and presence in Afghanistan and the region, they also did not want them to leave. Perhaps bleeding them white was an insidious objective, and US fell for it for the past 2 decades, apart from their own crass power projection and foolhardy decisions. I recall many years ago in India, we used to have some kind of an ad about a washing powder called Nirma. It says, "How come your shirt is whiter than mine?" Exactly the same way all these countries, ipso facto, are playing around in this graveyard of empires. So we might talk about these comedy of errors, but for the Afghans, truly, it is a monumental tragedy. So the current situation was very well known that it was going to happen. How soon it's going to happen was everybody's guess. But since 2018, we knew that this is going to play out. The Americans are bent upon leaving. The way, what kind of Afghanistan they will leave. They were talking to Taliban at the expense of the Afghan government. They themselves had brought it up or were supporting all through. They had great hopes in the Afghan army that they thought was one of the finest armies created and trained by virtually all NATO countries and many others, including in India, some of them. But the Doha Agreement, frankly, sealed the fate of the Afghan government, that we know it. And after that, the history everybody is watching on a daily basis. Now, these 2 decades have been the decades of hope and despair. Today's desperate situation, the scenes that we have seen at the airports, the kind of the difficulties the Afghans who really hoped that possibly the Western world, which stood for democracy, human rights, women's rights and all, will really stand up with them. But at the end of the day, the nationals, the countries, they have to look after themselves. And that is probably something that we need to take away from this particular situation. Now, Taliban also has become far more smarter in the past 2 decades. It has been trying to project some kind of a mellowed and a more acceptable image across the world through its various statements. But the fact remains whether Taliban is really fully competent, powerful, and is persuasive enough for its own ilk to follow the kind of principles, kind of policies they are projecting. I doubt it very much. Even within Taliban, there are a lot of groups, and apart from the ISIS, Khorasan, and the Al-Qaedas of this world, and let alone the large number of groups from Pakistan, and Lashkar-e-Toiba, of course, happens to be one of the top ones, and which fathered the ISIS-K as well. So we know that the Pakistan will continue to play a lead role, which I'm sure we will listen to it in greater details from our other colleagues and friends. Now, the 2 countries in this whole game that are going to play a much bigger, much stronger role and have already indicated that to fill this void that we are looking at, they are Russia and China. The Chinese are already looking at this in terms of their BRI project, in terms of their CPEC project, because they don't seem to find that for the CPEC, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan could actually be controlled by Pakistanis. So therefore, talking to Taliban gives them an edge. And I think that's precisely something that they are trying to do. Russians, on the other hand, are also gleefully feeling that. And I was involved in Russia since 2010 when I was posted there. And that time I saw that the Russians have been already opening their channels with and especially my friend Kabulov, with the Pakistanis and the Taliban. And they said that 7 years have not gone waste. Indeed, they have not. And today you see on the ground, the Russian and Chinese embassies are very much present there. Russian ambassador, Chinese ambassadors are speaking very openly about the way forward to this. And all of them are looking at the geoeconomics of it. And let's see how it's going to play there. And even at the UNSC, we have seen that the two countries are probably having some kind of a nexus. As far as West Asia is concerned, you remember that in the 1990s, 96 and all, when Taliban was only recognized by Pakistan, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And the Taliban actually was funded and founded by Pakistan, along with the help of $4 billion each by the Americans and the Saudis. And that continued forever and continued until recently. However, 2001 changed that totally. And if you were to really get to know that, you will have to read a book by a person whom I had several times met. And that is the book written called Afghanistan File, and by Prince Mukrind. You know, it says about exactly how they brought it up and what kind of difficulties the Saudis faced in dealing with Taliban, and eventually gave up on them in 2001 when they could not get Osama bin Laden out of the grips of Taliban, because Taliban said they will not turn him over. And that's when the Taliban and Al-Qaeda really got together. And I think that has been going on quite strongly. So we are seeing the Turkey's, this book is really an amazing insight into what happened and how it happened all over. And I would recommend to our friends, if they would like to just be released, so it is good to go through it, because that shows, because he headed he was the intelligence chief at the time, and I know how it worked out. Now, Saudi Arabia has distanced itself, but at the same time, as soon as the Taliban came to Kabul and controlled it, they really said that we must respect the wishes of the people. Their ambassador at the UN, he said clearly that we must respect. UAE has kept quiet. At the same time, the UAE, what has done, not only has taken many refugees, it has also given refuge to Ashraf Ghani. So it is unlikely that UAE is going to immediately recognize or do anything, whereas Saudi Arabia will probably watch for a little while, but I think sooner than later it will also recognize, because the relationship between them and Iran is more critical as far as Taliban 2.0 is concerned. And therefore, because the relations between Iran and Taliban have greatly improved, and you all know that the Zalmay Khalilzad was talking to the Iranians for quite some time now in the context of Afghanistan. So Taliban also had the rapprochement with the Iranians on that, and their consulates are continuing to work. And the Iranians have also started providing them assistance. It may not be a great surprise if the Hazaras and the Shia interests are acknowledged and taken care of by the current leadership. Then Iran may be one of the first countries possibly to recognize Taliban, in my view. It might be a bit difficult. So GCC states, we have seen that the blockade, Qatar blockade actually, was one of the driving forces for Qatar to move out and flex its muscles across the region and across the world. And it emerged as one of the key interlocutors, as a kind of a go-to guy for the Americans, for everybody, frankly. And till today, they have been playing an exceptionally good role, and they have great closeness. They have an office, and possibly de facto recognition of Taliban has been provided by them already. I mean, personally, I feel that since everybody is talking to them, it is mere a formality whether you recognize or you don't recognize. This is a tactic that most of the countries apply. But for the time being, as far as Taliban is concerned, they feel that they are quite okay with that. Oman has kept quiet. Oman even refused permission for to keep Ashraf Ghani. Likewise, the Central Asian country, which is also a very major concern for the Russians, and the terrorism in the context of terrorism, in the context of drug peddling, which is one of the key concerns for the Russians. So they have been all started doing their exercises with all these countries and try to create their own sort of a iron wall along the borders so that there is no way to fall out. Tajikistan is one country again, which does not like Taliban very much because of the homegrown terrorists who have affiliations with these. So Islamic Emirate continues to, in a way, give jitters to all the Gulf countries and its neighbors all along. So I think that the Saudi Arabia might take a flexible position depending on how Iran moves, and possibly will also go along with them. And then, of course, the Israelis are trying to look at it from a different perspective. They are looking at it that Abraham Accord countries now have a greater possibility of coming together against the terrorist groups. So as I mentioned always, that some kind of a cryptic might emerge vis-a-vis the Sunni countries, other Sunni countries, and that is China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, and Qatar as an outlier. So now you can add A to it as Afghanistan. That is pretty likely, and we don't know how things are. Of course, it will all depend on how the Western countries behave. If the USA, as it says that if Taliban continues to deliver, I don't know what capacities Taliban has to deliver on what they say, even if they want to. So we have a lot of possibilities there that they may not be able to do that. So would that mean that you will invoke sanctions against them? Of course, that would be counterproductive and will give to greater salience to Al-Qaeda and the ISIS for us. And even if Taliban somehow is able to keep its flock together. OIC met and has issued I would say, anodyne kind of a statement that they would not like any, but nobody has gone against Taliban per se. So I think that the Middle Eastern countries and the Chinese, of course, are going to be the biggest economic gainers in the process. Politically, Russians would try to make it into, once again, into the area of influence. So I think I've already taken my time and I would stop here. And thank you once again to everyone for joining today. And I'm here to listen to all the great experts that we have today on the. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving an apt speech for setting the ground for our event in the next 1 hour. And I'm so sorry, I had a bout of cough. I forgot to welcome and of course introduce you to you. Of course, don't need any introduction, but just a little introduction for people who have just joined us. Ambassador Trigunayat is a distinguished fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation, and he's a member of the advisory board Usanas Foundation. He has served in the Indian missions in Bangladesh, Mongolia, USA, Russia, Sweden, Nigeria, Libya, and Jordan. In the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, he served as the Director General for the Gulf and Hajj Division. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your comments. And I would also like to welcome Ambassador Pandey, Mr. Krishan Verma, and Mr. Pratap Heblikar, who are part of our audience today. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking out time and joining our event today. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Rubin, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. A former Pentagon official, Dr. Rubin has lived in the post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq. He's also spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. Welcome, sir. I would like to request you to give your speech for today. Sir, we're not able. Yes.
There. Thank you so much. I'm not going to repeat what was said with regard to Russia and China, much of which I agree with. Rather, I want to focus on other issues, especially coming out of Washington. One of the first, actually Jimmy Carter's first foreign policy speech in January of 1975, after he announced his candidacy for the presidency, was a declaration that he wanted to withdraw all US forces from Korea. At the time, most people didn't pay attention to him because he was considered such a long shot candidate. But by the time he clawed his way into the Democratic Party nomination, the Democratic National Convention had made as part of its platform the idea that the United States would withdraw all US forces from the Korean Peninsula. And what Carter had said was, we will still remain engaged in Korea. We'll just have an over-the-horizon capability and rely more on our Air Force and our Navy. Well, when he entered the presidency, his Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, came to the Oval Office early on and said that the US intelligence community has shown that the North Koreans are staging a military buildup. Carter, many people compare Joe Biden to Jimmy Carter. I don't compare the two because Jimmy Carter recognized reality. And when Jimmy Carter saw that the North Koreans were staging a buildup, he decided that he was going to change his policy, or at least moderate his policy. Then what the North Koreans did was try to take advantage of Jimmy Carter's desire for diplomacy. And they sent him a letter saying, let's negotiate. And what Jimmy Carter said is, we're not going to negotiate with North Korea unless South Korea is at the table. Again, here's another difference. I mean, certainly with Trump, but also with Biden, in that this whole mess started when the United States and Zalmay Khalilzad, the special envoy, decided to cut the elected Afghan government out of the peace talks. And when Jimmy Carter said no then, what North Korea did was focus its attention, focus its fury on Japan. And Jimmy Carter, again, would have none of this because he wasn't going to abandon any American allies for the sake of advancing his diplomatic strategy. So what I worry about when I see Joe Biden today is that he is no Jimmy Carter, that the ideology which he has adopted at the present time isn't geared towards reality. And his advisors, unlike Jimmy Carter's advisors, are much more sycophantic and are only going to tell Joe Biden what he wants to hear. The Lloyd Austin is no Harold Brown, and Jake Sullivan is no Zbigniew Brzezinski. So let's talk about Jake Sullivan and the future for a second. On Sunday, Jake Sullivan got on one of the most prestigious American talk shows, Face the Nation, and said that we will still continue to try to get Americans and the Afghans who worked with us out of the country because we have tremendous leverage over the Taliban. Well, what exactly does tremendous leverage mean? And he wasn't asked to explain, and Congress as yet hasn't asked him to explain. But Afghanistan has $9.4 billion in its foreign reserves, much of which is actually held in the United States. So it seems that Jake Sullivan is implying that our leverage is largely economic. And by that leverage, it suggests that the United States could be prepared, even though this certainly isn't something I would counsel, to bargain with the Taliban that $9.4 billion in exchange for releasing what in reality is America's largest hostage crisis in our history. And it's one completely of our making. Now, giving just a little bit of that money is like being just a little bit pregnant. I mean, if we are going to suggest to the Taliban that they can have some of that money because they are the government in charge, that implies recognition, even though that might not be the intention of the White House. And so what I worry about is what the Taliban could do with $9+ billion. Now, the former policy planning chief and a Gadfly diplomat who served several administrations, Dennis Ross, had written an article in the Washington Post saying the Americans shouldn't worry about all the criticism coming towards Biden, that we have undercut our credibility on the world stage. After all, the same arguments were made in 1975 when we withdrew from South Vietnam, and at several instances subsequently. I happen to disagree with Dennis Ross. I don't think we can prioritize the spin of Washington over the reality that credibility very much does matter. Remember, when Ronald Reagan withdrew from Beirut after the Marine barracks bombing, we didn't fully understand the ramifications at the time, but we certainly discovered them in 1993 when a Somali warlord, Mohammed Aidid, decided that he could take on the United States Army, and we had the Black Hawk Down incident. And then, of course, there was the issue of Osama bin Laden in 2001, who famously said, when you see a strong horse and a weak horse, it's natural to try to attach yourself to the strong horse. And it's certainly at this point in time, the Americans don't look like the strong horse. I agree with what the ambassador said with regard to Russia and China. I'm just as worried about Taiwan and what might happen, because the Americans are projecting an image of being a crippled pony. Now, we're also going to see immediate problems in Iraq, where, frankly, the Americans want to withdraw, and Syria, where Joe Biden bizarrely didn't realize we had 900 troops until the Pentagon corrected him after a press conference last week. We are wallowing in the delusion in Washington that we can isolate, that globalization doesn't matter, that it's the 19th century, and that the two oceans will provide enough security for us that we don't need to take into account what the rest of the world might think. Now, much more broadly, I'm also worried. I'm worried about Pakistan's collapse. I'll just get bottom line up front. The Pakistani elite have always believed that they can use radical Islamism for export only. I've never seen a country and experienced a country when I've traveled there with as little self-confidence as Pakistan. Pakistan, of course, was founded as a land for the Muslims, but we saw, especially in 1971, that ethnic identity could often trump that religious identity, simply because the Punjabis have forgotten that Islam and Punjab ethnic values and identity aren't one and the same. And so the Pakistanis have always used radical Islamism, especially after 1971, as the glue to hold their country together. But every time we've seen a country try this strategy, to try to use jihadism and radical Islamism for export, whether it was Saudi Arabia, whether it was Syria, or whether it was more recently Turkey, there's always been blowback. Now, Pakistan will often complain that they've also suffered in the fight against terrorism, but that's the blowback which they're suffering. And while they may believe that they can dominate an Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, we saw after the Bunir incident and the North Waziristan incidents in 2006, that it doesn't take much for some of these radicals to try to march on Islamabad. I've sat in the Islamabad club and had whiskey with the former director of the ISI when I was doing my book research back in 2010, and it's a world apart. But when I walk around Pindi, it's a whole different world. And frankly, many of the Pakistani elites don't walk around Pindi and don't take public buses and so forth. They don't realize just how tenuous Pakistani security is. Just one issue I would add to Russia. Russia, of course, is going to try to deal with the Taliban, to try to co-opt the Taliban, because Russia's concern is Islam. But it's not the Islam emanating from the North Caucasus, from Dagestan and Chechnya. It's the Islam and the radicalization which they may face in Tatarstan. According to some demographers, like Nick Eberstadt, within 10 years, 30% of the conscripts to the Russian military will be Muslim. And therefore, Russia needs to not only worry about its southern flank of the former Soviet states like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so forth, but it has its own domestic issues, which they don't like talking about, but which, frankly, we will be talking about within about 10 years. Now, the only issue I would have with what the ambassador said before is the Americans didn't create the Taliban. That's anachronistic. The Taliban were created in 1994, which means they were they were basically in diapers at the time of the Soviet invasion. And I'll be as critical as the CIA as anyone in their short-sightedness, but the CIA doesn't arm kindergartners. That said, we did have our dalliance with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. That was a mistake. And we had the same problem which the world is now going to have again, in that Afghanistan is landlocked. And when it came time back in 1979 to arm the Mujahideen, the Pakistanis, the Saudis contributed the money, the Americans contributed the arms, and the Pakistanis distributed them only to the Peshawar 7, only to the Islamists, and it fundamentally changed the character of Afghanistan. That's going to continue into the future. And then the question within Washington is, and this is something which India can take the lead on, is whether there can be any alternate route through a place like Chabahar. Now, the Taliban have never really been tested militarily on the battlefield. The way Afghans fight is they show up, and whoever has the biggest guns claims victory, and everyone else lives to fight another day. We're starting to see a resistance form in the Panjshir Valley, and I wouldn't discount that. I wouldn't be surprised if Iran and the Russians, through some of the Central Asian states, will also start a plan B, which is to try to create a proxy ethnic warlords like they did in the past in order to create a buffer. And if those states have the bigger guns, then it is conceivable in Farah, Nimruz, and Herat, for example, that the Taliban could be pushed back. Because if they're forced to fight, they might not be able to. The wild card, I would really say, is Turkey, and I don't foresee Turkey playing a positive role in the future. When I went to visit the Islamic Emirate in March of 2000, there were 3 countries that recognized the Taliban: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Pakistan. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the ambassador has certainly provided his analysis. Now, what I worry about is that Turkey might actually not only arm the Islamic Emirate, but as we're seeing in Ethiopia, as we're seeing in elsewhere, might provide them perhaps with drones, which they might use to take on the Panjshir Valley in exchange for commercial contracts and so forth. That's my worry moving forward. Let me turn the floor back to the host. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your comments. Now I will like to welcome Ms. Meena Nizami, who is a women's rights advocate from Afghanistan. She has majored in applied psychology, and she's the founder and president of Girl Up Afghanistan. Now, Girl Up is a United Nations Foundation initiative working to advance girls' skills, rights, and opportunities to be leaders. And she is also actively engaged in applying her leadership and psychological skills to promote gender equality and bring social change to Afghanistan. She has led a campaign for menstrual hygiene management and maternal health care awareness campaign workshops for adolescent girls in 18 schools of rural Kandahar, Afghanistan. She also helped girls in Afghanistan to establish their own Girls Up clubs in the American University of Afghanistan and Kabul. She is presently writing a research paper on the impact of war on women and children's mental health in Afghanistan. And she's interested in assessing and improving the mental health care in Afghanistan. Welcome. I would like to welcome you on the behalf of Usanas Foundation. You may please give your comments.
Thank you, Hasija, for the brief introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. And thanks to Usanas Foundation and Mr. Mukhopadhyay for recommending me to be here today among you all, and for organizing this event to discuss the implication of Taliban taking over in Afghanistan and its impacts on women of Afghanistan. So to begin with, I will be speaking from a psychological and women's perspective in Afghanistan and of what peace means to me and to the Afghan woman. Speaking of the geopolitical importance of Afghanistan, as we all know, it is located in the heart of Asia, and it has access to numerous number of resources and minerals, and also to more than 5 countries, neighboring countries that are so vital in terms of politics to the US and to the Russia, the 2 superpowers that have had a long access ties to each other. So Afghanistan has become a base for those 2 countries to be there and to occupy with the name of peace, that we want to bring peace. Now, speaking of what peace means to us, the very understanding of peace differs across languages and cultures. So for most Western definitions, peace tend to be emphasizing the absence of violence. Like to the American military, historically, the word peace essentially meant the absence of war. Therefore, by militaries, they fought wars to win the peace, or they used force to maintain peace. However, in Afghanistan, for the people of Afghanistan, and especially women, for us, peace doesn't mean achieving it through war. For us, for Afghan people, it's more of a harmonious and a religious relationship to have among each other to bring peace. Now, in accordance with what American military's history's point of view, it is understood as to why peace is mostly defined as an absence of war. This is because of the history of the human society. That whenever war occurs, people need peace, and then they ask for peace. So we know that in 2001, when the US came to Afghanistan with the aim to counter terrorism, that in fact, instead of bringing peace for the past 20 years, it has resulted in loss of thousands of civilians' lives, physical destructions of hospitals, girls' schools, maternity wards, mosques, universities, and victimization of numbers of outspoken journalists and women's rights activists, and much more. So we see the repetition of what has been happening for the past 20 years. We did not see peace. We did not achieve peace, neither in the 20 years of the past, and neither now. So therefore, people want to have peace, and because peace was aimed to be achieved through military forces by the US, we couldn't do that. That didn't happen. And until the US signed an agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan with the Taliban, that actually paved a way for the intra-Afghan peace negotiation talks of the Taliban with the Afghan government. Now, when the Taliban took over, we saw that there was so much panic around the country, especially for women and a lot of other people. They wanted to leave the country, flee the country, to go, out of the country, because they thought that the Taliban of today would be the same as the 20 years ago. And none of us at the moment can guarantee that the Taliban have actually changed, or what they say, that they respect women's rights and they don't have a problem with them studying or with their education and work. We cannot guarantee that, because we see that in the history, they did not respect any of those rights, and there was so much violence, physical, emotional, sexual, and all kinds of violence against women that the Taliban did. So we are not ignoring those facts, that what they did 20 years ago. Now, if we want to have a way forward, if we want to move forward and focus more on nation building rather than thinking of who won the war and who lost the war and who will get what position, that is, I think, what is our focus. And especially the political idea of women in Afghanistan is not about it is not about who will get the position. It is about, even if it's the Taliban or the government, women's rights should be respected and maintained at all costs. Because even during the government that we had under President Ashraf Ghani, women's rights were not really attained, completely. Yes, there were few developments that we saw in the past 20 years, but they were not totally up to the mark. Now, with the Taliban takeover, that would be something like, like an intra-Afghan negotiation that has to take place. And we saw that in the February 2020, we had female representatives that sat on the same table across Taliban, such as Habiba Sarabi, Fatima Gilani, Sharifa Zurmati Wardak, and Fauzia Kufi. So these were our representatives that they tried their best to protect the rights of Afghan women in these peace negotiations. And so we see that if they were able to sit on the same table with the Taliban and discuss all of these issues for them to be able to have power in the government, they should respect women's rights, and they agreed on it. So that would be a sign for us to look forward to something, because the more we keep denying that it is not going to happen, it is not going to happen. So what I think would be the best possible solution is that after the Taliban takeover, we are not sure if the Taliban has promised as to respecting women's rights will be proven or not, but I believe that women should be at the forefront of peacekeeping and peace building. That is the change of the contradictory attitude towards through the dialogue and mediated negotiations, and peace building, which is the process towards a positive peace after the war, and that includes the ceasefire agreement and normalization and reconciliation. So if we have women in front of all this, I think we have a way to look forward to. We have a future to look forward to, that there will be no war, and we can focus actually on nation building. And what people fear about the Taliban would be also contradictory. If they fear the Sharia law, that is the Islamic way of ruling the country, or is it actually a group of people that is the Taliban, implying this? Because Afghanistan in both scenarios, before Taliban or after Taliban, will be following a Sharia law. So I don't think following a Sharia law for the 97.7% of the Muslim population would be a problem, because except for the minorities that we have, the Sikh minorities, the Hindu minorities, that should be respected at all costs as well. But I think for the rest of 97.7% of the population, having a Sharia law would not be a problem. So how will that be imposed and followed with respecting the human rights is what we need to discuss and talk about. And for us Afghans, the end of war or does not mean only the cessation of the direct violence of war. We also want to achieve the cessation of the structural and cultural violence that will have a long way to achieve, to go, but there are a lot of things to work out on. But we need to take first step at a time. So therefore, I request the international community, the Usanas Foundation and other international leaders to do not abandon Afghan people during these desperate times, to help them to support education. As we all know, the schools are closed in Afghanistan, the universities are closed, and that is very difficult for students to move forward. And it all affects on the morale of the people, because they can't go to school, they can't go to university, they can't go to work. That's how the fear and the panic is increasing day by day, and the stress that is going to that is being put on the people, that is going to cause even more panic. And I request the international community to, instead of having a new political agendas in Afghanistan, they should actually work on the nation building, on what we achieved in the past 20 years should not go to waste, and have talk with the Taliban that these achievements should be maintained and more worked upon. So we are also in the dire need of female professors in the universities, as we saw that the Taliban mentioned that schools and universities will be open, but with separate education for women and girls, that women would be in separate classes and men in separate classes, or boys and girls. So I don't think that would be an issue, but we also see that we lack female teachers in Afghanistan, especially in universities. So that does not that should not mean that we will not have education for women. So if we lack female teachers, we want the international community to focus on that, to bring international teachers, female teachers, to teach our students. So yeah, that basically is, no matter what happens, we should not give up on the education and involvement of women in Afghanistan. And that's all we want from the international community and the international leaders. Thank you everyone for having me. This is Mina.
Thank you for of course bringing in this perspective, because I think most of the seminars that we are having on Afghanistan would lack this perspective that you've given. Thank you for this. The next speaker is Mr. Christopher Alexander. I would like to welcome you, sir. He's a former diplomat and former Conservative Party of Canada politician. He has served as Canada's Minister of Citizenship and Immigration from 2013 to 2015. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's an honor to be with the Usanas Foundation and to be following Mina Jan. To hear from Afghans is the most important thing for all of us at this point. And if we continue to listen to those who are on the ground or have their ears to the ground and are hearing what's happening across Afghanistan and tailor our policies based on those true accounts of what Afghans are experiencing, then we probably can't go far wrong. Let me touch on three quick issues in my remarks. First, we have to understand what has happened in Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks. I'm struck on social media today and in the Western media that enjoys decent reputation for quality, at the number of attempts already being made to rationalize what has happened, draw a line under the violence and the violations of the recent past, and start anew with a kind of tabula rasa with this new Taliban regime. I think that would be a terrible mistake. The Taliban haven't just returned to Afghanistan. They have, in only 95 days, conducted an invasion with the full support of Pakistan's ISI, the Pakistani military, and its senior leadership that took the whole world by surprise. The speed and comprehensiveness of the takeover was not predicted by anyone. And in doing so, in overwhelming Afghanistan's legitimate institutions, chasing an elected government out of town, and cutting off Afghanistan from its partnerships with the outside world, at least for now, holding most Afghans literally hostage in a situation that very few of them desired, threatening those who worked for the previous government or in sensitive positions such as human rights defender, women's rights activists, journalists, etc., forcing them to live in fear. By doing all of this, the Taliban, with its Pakistani sponsors, have violated international law in an extremely fundamental way. It wasn't just Afghans that engaged in nation building over the past 20 years. It wasn't just Afghans that voted in successive elections for parliaments, for presidents. It wasn't just Afghans that sought to rebuild their villages, restart or start anew companies, NGOs. It was Afghanistan in partnership with over 70 donors, with over 50 countries that provided military forces. It was an unprecedented experiment in trying to make a least developed country, one of the Asia's lowest ranking countries in terms of per capita income, into a viable, stable state that would have high growth rates, robust institutions, and enjoy a bright future. But all of that investment depended on, as it turns out, one goal that was never achieved. There had to be an end to external interference in Afghanistan. There had to be an end to the sanctuaries, the support, the training, the intelligence, the arms supplies, the weapons supplies that came to the Taliban from outside the country, primarily from Pakistan. And despite some efforts by the United States and others to hold Pakistan to account, it turns out that those efforts were entirely unsuccessful. And that in fact, when Zalmay Khalilzad, Mike Pompeo, and the Trump administration signed their deal in February 1st and then in November of last year with the Taliban to, as they hoped, bring peace to the country through power sharing, a withdrawal of troops, and eventually a ceasefire, the Pakistani military planners, who were not present in those talks, but who obviously control the Taliban's actions and decisions almost completely, they went to work deciding that their invasion of Afghanistan would begin immediately after the withdrawal of foreign forces. And so that was scheduled to be at the end of April. General Bajwa, the chief of the army staff, went to Afghanistan on May 11th, as it turned out, May 10th, I believe, in a British aircraft. General Sir Nick Carter, the chief of the British Defense Forces, defense staff, said recently on television that he had every reason to believe that General Bajwa was sincere in wishing there to be power sharing and a peaceful outcome. In fact, General Bajwa went home on that British aircraft, and the Pakistani-backed Taliban invasion of Afghanistan, full-scale invasion, began the next day on May 11th and took only 95 days to occupy every province but one and send the government scuttling into exile or to Panjshir as they became the power brokers in Kabul. So this is an invasion by a neighboring country using proxy forces, an invasion that violates borders, sovereignty, international law on almost every level. If any other country was enduring this kind of aggression, there would be emergency meetings of the Security Council, there would be immediate sanctions, there would be calls for the Taliban to desist or face the consequences, as provided for under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which makes us all responsible, in fact, for political and, if necessary, military measures to uphold the international order. In Afghanistan's case, none of this has happened. And why is that so? In my view, it's because the US has been trapped in its own illogic for a number of years now. The Trump administration was a particular low point, and that deal with the Taliban, a blot on the US record that will be hard to expunge. In effect, in 2020, the US did a deal with the enemies that had been killing its own forces and excluded from that deal the allies that had been fighting alongside their own forces. An unprecedented level of perversion, I would say, in diplomatic practice, which has now led to disaster. But before that dark moment last year, there were a number of other facts of US history that made this result, if not inevitable, then certainly one that can be explained by history. We heard a reference earlier by Michael Rubin to Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Obviously, there are many people, both Democrats and Republicans, who still see Pakistan as an essential ally, as a country to be cherished, because it, in their words, helped the United States win the Cold War by being a partner through 1979 to 1989. There are also those in the United States and beyond who see Pakistan as an essential partner because of its role in preparing Henry Kissinger's and Richard Nixon's opening to China in the early 1970s. The secret first visits went through Pakistan, obviously, and Pakistan's role as arguably China's most important ally has been used by them to leverage US influence ever since the US began to normalize relations with China, and that Pakistani leverage has only increased as the US became a strategic economic partner of China in recent decades. And then thirdly, there is the more recent phenomenon, which has deeper roots, but is particularly strong in the Republican Party in recent years, of Washington, some politicians themselves, some in official roles in State Department, Defense, or elsewhere, some in think tanks, some in business, who see partnership with Pakistan as necessary in order to isolate and ultimately undo the hold of theocracy on Iran. This whole idea of the right-hand punch, the US making endless compromises with Pakistan in order to be able to finally turn enough force through irregular warfare, economic isolation, and other means against Iran to bring down the theocrats regime, to bring down the Ayatollahs. We saw some of that happening even when I was in Afghanistan, when some US partners were working with Pakistan's ISI to create Jundullah and other groups that then conducted operations inside Iran. It didn't go very far at that time, but this school of thought still persists, that Pakistan must be indulged even if it supports terrorist groups, because they are one of our essential local allies against Iran. So what has this legacy yielded for the United States today? Well, a failed military effort after 20 years, international humiliation, a group of 35 to 40 million, population of 35 to 40 million Afghans who are now facing famine, a banking crisis, economic crisis, the end or serious disruption of education, healthcare, because the US has been outwitted, and a game that has been going on for almost 50 years has been played against them in a way that they were not prepared for. And ultimately, I think this has happened because for 10 years, at least, the US has not been a very coherent player. The US has been sliding into isolationism. The US has been racked by successive domestic political crises, polarization, and there isn't serious discussion, to be honest, of foreign policy issues, either in US news media or in US politics. And so perhaps it was inevitable that a mission as complex as the Afghan one and a region as important and multifaceted as South Asia would be neglected, and ultimately these perversions would come to light. So let me conclude on this note. Pakistan has been backing Islamists in Afghanistan since the early 1970s. They've been doing it as a way of compensating, as their defense establishment saw things, for the loss of East Pakistan. The only alternative after losing conventional wars with India was to fight irregular wars in Afghanistan that would ultimately give advantage in Kashmir, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and beyond. It is this war, this hybrid proxy war that Pakistan has been fighting, that is the real challenge. And it is this threat to international peace and security that deserves our attention more than anything else. Our response today, in my view, should be to try to deliver for the Afghan people, but to do so by relentlessly refusing to give legitimacy to the Taliban regime, which will be incapable of governing itself, to insist on doing it through UN programs, through NGOs, or other forms of delivery over which responsible players in the region and beyond will have control. Secondly, we should immediately support the resistance that has held out in Panjshir. As Afghanistan slides into ever greater hardships and humanitarian crisis, the appeal of this democratic continuity, not extinguished, but now reduced in territorial circumstances to Panjshir and a few other districts, will grow. And we should be ready to build on that when the opportunities arise. But finally, we should react to Pakistan's invasion of Afghanistan the way we reacted to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the way we have reacted to other crises such as that on the Korean Peninsula in the early 1950s, when one country, by proxy or directly, invades another country. These are extremely serious matters. If we do not condemn the Taliban and their Pakistani sponsors for what they have done, I shudder to think what dictators elsewhere in the world, not just in Iran, Pakistan, China, and Russia, but even beyond, what conclusions they might draw about the state of international law and the ability of democracies and rule-abiding populations, law-abiding populations, to uphold the basics of the international order. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Mr. Abhinav Pandya. He is the CEO and founder of Usanas Foundation. Abhinav, I'd like to welcome you, and you can give your comments for the session.
Thank you so much, Namrata. And I would like to extend my thanks to the esteemed speakers of today's panel. Yeah, so in my remarks, I'm mostly going to focus on the security aspect and the impact of Taliban's takeover on India's security. But most of these concerns are relevant for not only for India's security, but also for the entire South Asian security and also for the Western countries. So let me begin with I have divided into like two parts, with the three parts: external security, internal security, and the social security of India. So after the Pulwama suicide bombing, when India retaliated with the Balakot strike, there was a perception in the Pakistani strategic establishment that in the future, any kind of such a large terror attack will be met with a massive retaliation, and that would be something above what India did in Balakot. So that was a barrier which prevented Pakistan from propping up terror groups or like initiating some large-scale terror strike in India. But today, after the Taliban takeover, Pakistan and Pakistan's strategic establishments, ISI in particular, feels that India is in a vulnerable position because on one hand, we have like increasingly deteriorating relationship with China, and in Afghanistan, the Americans are out. Besides that, 2019 President Trump was more active, and the current regime is not, as per the Pakistani thinking, is not going to be very active on the Indian defense side. And thirdly, we face a gang of adversaries in Afghanistan in the form of nation states like Turkey, and also a kind of, a range of non-state actors, which includes Jaish-e-Mohammed, Taliban, Haqqani Network, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and all these countries. So there is an increasing possibility that if there is some kind of friction on the India-China border, then China may instigate Pakistan to heat up the Pakistani side. And at the same time, they may try to infiltrate the Indian Kashmir with a large number of terrorists or some of the battle-hardened Afghan Mujahideen veterans, the Talibani terrorists, okay, in Kashmir, and they may incite the local people into some kind of a street anarchy, for which we have a substantial ground in Jammu and Kashmir. because if we see right now, this Taliban's victory has been seen as some kind of a victory of Islam against the infidels, and the general population, I'm talking about the general sentiment, they feel that since the people the Talibani forces chose to stuck to the path of devotion, they could oust the infidel foreign power. Okay. And I mean, I can like substantiate what I just said, because if we go to social media and check out the media handles of some very literate, some very educated senior journalists, they are making such remarks and they are celebrating Taliban's victory. Today only I just read one very senior prominent journalist who even represents, like, many of our organizations in several meetings and conferences. He said that in Hindi, he said, the last Bagoda is out, which in English means the last absconder is out. Okay, he was referring to Major General Krishna. I'm not able to recollect the name. So if that is the situation, if we are facing a twin front situation, and if there is some kind of a street anarchy like the way it happened in 2016, then it can be difficult for India in terms of the movement of forces and troops. Secondly, after this Taliban takeover, Pakistan is likely to shift most of the terror training camps to Pakistan, to Afghanistan, which gives Pakistan a very convincing deniability, and operate all these training camps from Pakistan, send all these terrorists to Kashmir and various other parts of India, and just get them to strike a major, organize a major terror strike. Besides that, all the large amounts of American weaponry which has fallen in the hands of Taliban is certainly some of them, I mean, a good number of them is going to land up with the Kashmiri militants. Okay. And we have seen in the recent encounters that some of the M4 carbine weapons and even the Pika guns, which were used in Afghanistan, and the weapons used by NATO forces, one can see them, the Kashmiri militants using those weapons. So until recently, the Kashmiri terrorist groups were facing a massive weapons crunch because of two things: the NIA action on terror financing, and because of the strengthening of the counter-infiltration grid. But now that's why they were snatching weapons from the security forces. But now, since they will get hold of the weapons left by Americans, so that's going to be a major problem. And some of these sniper and assault rifles are far superior to what our forces have in the valley. And they're not just few, they're in large numbers. I was, the last figure which I vaguely remember was some 600,000, including the assault rifles and the small pistols and all. So that is going to be a major problem. Besides that, we will face a major internal security problem in terms of radicalization, because Taliban's victory has been projected as some kind of a victory of austere and pure religious forces. Okay. So that is, I mean, until recently, the Indian Muslims stayed away from the Al-Qaeda narrative or even ISIS. Though I mean, at least not much, but at least a decent number joined from Kerala, about 100 or 100 plus. But in the future, this is a possibility that the people will be lured to this narrative because of two things. Because firstly, especially Taliban and Islamic State has shown that the model of Khilafat is something which is possible in the real world. And secondly, the radicalization activities are in a very high momentum in India. And Turkey is also playing a very crucial role in radicalization, radicalizing local Muslims in India. They are reaching out to people even at the local imam level, even in the smallest areas. And in Kashmir also, if you see, Turkey is very high on the narrative warfare through its media portals, through social media, through TRT World. They are reaching out to clerics in India. And in Afghanistan, we see that Turkey is going to be a significant player. So, I mean, this radicalization certainly is going to be a major problem for us. And we have seen in the past also, in 2016, Indian agencies discovered that Pakistan's ISI was instigating, they were motivating Indian youth to join ISKP. And they were not coming, they were not showing themselves as the main force, but they were putting up the front of ISKP, but they were acting in behind. So that is a possibility that since ISKP, which is another new terror proxy funded and run and sheltered by Pakistan, is going to be a lucrative option for some of the radicalized segments in India. Okay. And then I feel that even this ideological problem may spread to Pakistan also, because the Taliban believes in Deobandi extremist ideology. And there are affiliated groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harkatul Mujahideen, Harkatul Ansar, Sipah-e-Sahaba, Lashkar-e-Jangvi, which, I mean, they all have a very strong and a very robust presence in Pakistani society. I mean, most of these people, the cadres of Taliban, they come from Madrasa-e Haqqaniya and Madrasa-e Binoria. So these guys have a long history in Pakistan, and I mean, even I mean, they're very powerful when it comes to their presence in comparison with the Pak army also. So for Pakistan army, it won't be that easy to control these Taliban or Deobandi affiliated groups like Jaish and Taliban. I mean, the way they can control Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is supposed to be firmly under the grip of Pak army, it's not the case with these Deobandi affiliated groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Harkatul Mujahideen. But more and more, I mean, if these radical ideologies gain more ground in Pakistan, certainly, I mean, it's going to have its fallout and ramifications among the Indian Muslim population also, and that's going to be problematic for us. And I mean, a few final points, because if Talibani, if this radical ideology, if they make their headway in Central Asian countries or even the other South Asian countries like Nepal, Maldives, or like Sri Lanka, then Pakistan will gain strategic depth in these countries. And I mean, certainly given this current situation, India is going to be, I mean, will have some challenges, major challenges as far as security and diplomatic equations are concerned. So I guess, these are my final remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhinav. Our next speaker is Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay. He's India's former ambassador to Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. He has served in various capacities in Indian embassies and missions in Mexico, Cuba, France, and the United Nations, the Ministry of Defense of India. He also reopened the Indian embassy in Kabul in November 2001 as charge d'affaires after the ouster of the Taliban in Afghanistan in November 2001. I'd like to welcome you, sir, and please give your comments for the evening.
Right. Thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking, like the others, the Usanas Foundation for inviting me, and also to the panelists for some outstanding presentations. It is actually invidious to single out, one or two speakers on such in such a brilliant panel. But let me just say that I completely associate myself with both the moral clarity, as Michael Rubin described, and the content of Mr. Chris Alexander's statement. And I'm especially thankful to Meena Nizami for joining this panel at a very late stage, in fact, only this, and for bringing not only an Afghan voice, but actually a voice of peace rooted in the experiences of women, and especially women in armed conflict. In fact, as it has turned out, Mr. Alexander has said much of what I would have liked to say, but let me add some elements, and in some cases, let me just speak at a little bit of a tangent. So the first question is, how have we come to this? Who are responsible? And I would say, yes, of course, there are three parties that are most responsible. One, of course, is the Afghan government for their mostly, I would say, failures of omission. The second clearly is Pakistan, because Pakistan has had the destabilization of Afghanistan, and in particular, as Mr. Alexander described, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan through a proxy force that has an Afghan face but a brainwashed Pakistani mind and Pakistani hands behind it. And if we analyze the reasons for that, it's very clear that for Pakistan, they have a vested interest in keeping Afghanistan permanently unstable, so that a strong and united Afghanistan can never be a threat to Pakistan, about which they have a mortal fear. To externalize its Pashtun problem and the Durand Line problem to Afghanistan, and therefore to keep that issue subdued and in a secondary position. Third, of course, to exclude India from Afghanistan, to try to actually sever India's historical association with Afghanistan that included political, economic, in particular trade and cultural relations that go back to the Grand Trunk Road, to Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and to, let's say, the latest of them, Dilip Kumar and Kabuliwala. And of course, the fourth, strategic depth. So I think the Pakistani role is very clear. One element of the Pakistani role, which Mr. Alexander described very brilliantly, but that has escaped international attention, is the fact that Pakistan has prepared for this occupation and invasion for 20 years after the ouster of the Taliban. Taliban 1.0 was actually not a terrorist organization. It was a repressive, fundamentalist, obscurantist, atavistic government that Pakistan did not allow the slightest development. When I reached there in November 2001, 1 week after the ouster of the Taliban, there was not even the first element of reconstruction from the intra-Mujahideen fighting of the 90s. That was how backward Pakistan actually kept Afghanistan. But since 2001, we have seen, we talk about Taliban 2.0, but Taliban 2.0 began after 2001, when the same students from those madrasas that Abhinav just spoke about, where they were radicalized initially to act as a kind of student army into Afghanistan, and they were received then as a kind of stabilizing force under a respected religious preacher. They were radicalized. They were then converted into, a pool was created to recruit suicide bombers. An entire industry, logistics industry was created to support that industry. And if I just do a sort of back of the envelope count of the number of intelligence tips and threats that I faced during my tenure there, we would be talking about an industry of thousands of people who had been created for that invasion. But since then, it has been a very complex operation that really has escaped focus of people, which is that it has been firstly a radicalization now not only of madrasa students across the Durand line, but also of mullahs who have then preached in Afghanistan. This has become the Trojan horse by which they have actually entered and radicalized and started a kind of information campaign, an information war that then led to a very complicated, very sophisticated psychological operation. And what you saw finally in the end was also a very sophisticated military strategy and a military tactics beginning from the north, securing the borders in the north and the west before coming to the south and the east, which were in any case borders shared with Pakistan. A very sophisticated military strategy. None of this could have been planned in the Taliban itself. And they were all masterminded in every single respect by the Pakistanis. And it's not accidental that even the international community, when it talks to the Taliban now, talks to spokespersons, talks to deputy leaders, but we have not seen or met or heard the leaders, because the leaders are really puppet masters in Pakistan. But I think this entire, this psychological war, the information war, the combination of this radicalization and the military tactics I find it difficult to believe could have even escaped the US attention or knowledge. And certainly I think this is something that we need to look into. And we need to study, we need to examine. Actually, it is a very sophisticated military strategy that in effect actually implements what has been prescribed in Sun Tzu's famous, art of war. In passing, I also want to thank Mr. Alexander for bringing out the UK role, because this is something that is extremely subdued. Very often, the United States, US presidents, both Bush, Obama, as well as Trump, clearly identified that the problem lay in Pakistan. And yet they were never able to convert that knowledge, convert that insight into coercive diplomatic action against Pakistan. And in fact, consistently used carrots rather than sticks in dealing with Pakistan. And the primary reason for that was US pleading with the US and with the UK pleading with the US and the international community that you cannot look at Afghanistan without looking at India and the Kashmir problem as well. And in some ways, ending up rationalizing and justifying the use of to exporting a bilateral problem to a third country, and that too by the use of terrorism. I think that behind the scenes involvement came totally in the open in the Bajwa General Nick Carter collaboration that took place at the last stage, which Mr. Alexander referred to. A second point that I'd like to make here is about the United States. It's tempting to believe that the United States has landed in this position, out of a benign, desire to leave Afghanistan because of corruption and the headache that it had become, or even because it realized that it was providing net security for its principal strategic rivals in the region and in the world, China, Russia, and Iran. But in fact, if we see the active involvement of the United States in stacking the decks against the Afghan government and Afghan people, by negotiating behind the Afghan government and people, by legitimizing the Taliban and delegitimizing the Afghan government, by separating the US Taliban part of the deal from the Afghan part of the deal, which was supposed to be a composite agreement, and in every respect, not stopping a kind of Taliban, over military takeover of Afghanistan. I sincerely believe that there was more to it. This was an active US design to actually set the Taliban on the region, to destabilize the region, with Afghanistan and Afghanistan's friends and neighbors like Central Asian republics and India as collateral. And it's baffling to think at one level that the United States should cede strategic space in Afghanistan at the weakest underbelly of China in Xinjiang. But if one understood the bringing in the Taliban at this stage in terms of keeping the Chinese off balance, perhaps that puzzle could be explained. But I would add one more element. In many ways, I think the Chinese are also preparing themselves to puncture the Central Asian mountains by positioning themselves in the Ladakh range, the Karakoram range, and the Pamirs, to be able to escape the pressure that they are facing in the Indo-Pacific from the United States and Quad, by puncturing the Central Asian mountains and getting across to the Persian Gulf with the help of its 400 billion 25-year geo-economic deal with strategic overtones with Iran. So there is a very complex game going on here. The United States started off with a counter-terrorist objective. It expanded to a counterinsurgency operation, learning from the lessons from Iraq. It converted that to a training and equipment mission. And now I suspect that it is entering a kind of intelligence war in the region, playing with fire. The United States is extremely responsible for the current situation. It looked at Afghanistan not as strategic of value. It looked at it purely as collateral. It came there only with a counter-terrorist objective. It never invested in Afghanistan as a country or as an economy. It knew that it sat on 3 trillion worth of mineral wealth. It did not invest a penny. It did not invest a penny in the real economy of the people, which is agriculture and rural industry. Build an Afghan national army. It only built counter-terrorism special forces, which probably numbered less than the Taliban, who had to fight from place to place. It kept the entire army technically and technologically dependent on the United States. It did not invest in institution building or nation building. In fact, it said nation building light, only the minimum amount left, apart from the American University of Afghanistan. It did not really invest in democracy either. It invested in nothing. It spent a lot of money, which of course ended up in a gravy train of gravy train that was grabbed by power brokers, contractors, both American and Afghan, and third country, as well as opportunists and adventurers. So, this is in terms of who are responsible for it. I don't know how much time I have left, probably not very much, 2 minutes. So let me just end by saying what we can do. I agree with a lot with Ms. Nazami said. In some respects, reality is a reality. And I think at this stage, we should heed the Afghan desire for peace and reconciliation. And although I don't believe that this transitional arrangement or administration that the Taliban are professing to cobble together will actually be inclusive, I think it is something that we need to give a chance. We need to explore, given the biggest problems of Afghanistan right now are the fact that people want to leave, that there is a huge internally displaced issue, a person's issue, that there is a large humanitarian problem which is only going to get bigger. This is just the beginning. That we need to explore. And I totally agree with Mr. Alexander when he says no legitimization, no recognition. In fact, support the legitimate Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in whatever form it is. But I think at this stage, until circumstances change, and I would like to make a point on that as well, there is a humanitarian window that we should explore without legitimizing, without recognizing the Taliban, but trying to use the UN to impose leverage on the Taliban government to get across humanitarian aid to the people who are most distressed, and to pressurize the Taliban into allowing those people who want to leave and escape, repression and and past practices of the Taliban, including now forced marriages and abductions of women. So I would say that, I would end, and there's a lot that we can do. For example, India can open its doors in many ways to these people who want temporary asylum or temporary visas to India. We have started off with the emergency visa, but there are serious obstacles to it, which run the risk of really squandering our 3 billion worth of goodwill that we have earned over the last 20 years. And I appeal to the Ministry of Home Affairs and the government authorities in India to take a much more sympathetic and compassionate view of this. We can keep our educational institutions open for Afghans. We can keep our hospitals open for Afghans. We can work for flights so that Afghans can come to India for trade and for medical treatment. We should still work on that P2P relationship without legitimizing the Taliban. We can provide a space for Afghan media in India that needs to relocate. We can provide spaces for scholars and think tanks in India. Most of all, we should keep the idea of the Islamic Republic and democracy and the fruits of the last 20 years and the progressive principles of the Islamic Republic alive. Looking into the future, much as though I would like to believe what Ms. Nizami said, that the Taliban may be persuaded to work for peace in Afghanistan. What I fear with the explosions that have taken place since August 27 at the Kabul airport is that we are entering into a new phase of radicalism. If we see from the Taliban, we have seen a progressive downward spiral from the Taliban to, from Taliban 1.0 to Taliban 2.0 to the, revival of Al-Qaeda and now the ISIS. And what I really sincerely fear is that if this Al-Qaeda ISIS conflict is serious, and if all the other terror organizations that are involved in the Taliban conglomerate get active in Afghanistan, then we are likely to see, together with the resistance starting from Panjshir Valley, an Afghanistan that is much closer to Iraq and Syria and Libya, except much closer to our borders. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think I'll just thank all the panelists for giving us a wonderful session today. And we'll just start with the Q&A session. And I think because it's been a wonderful session, I just see appreciation posts. There are hardly any questions, but there are two questions that we would start with. The first question is, should India open a political dialogue with the Taliban in the longer run, so as it does not lose the hold it has gained through its investments in the last decade? It's not addressed to any particular panelist. I think Ambassador Trigunayat has said something about it already in the chat box. But so probably I can go one by one to all the panelists if they would like to respond to it. And first, I'd like to invite Ambassador Trigunayat if he would like to say anything in particular.
Well, one thing is there. I mean, we all know that the situation is still evolving in Afghanistan. And of course, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay is the authority, and he's already said what we need to do. But at the same time, I mean, I do not agree with the view that we have not had any contacts with Taliban, or we did not talk to them. And if we did not talk to them, then I think we were not looking above the surface. For example, when the Americans were talking to Taliban, when the uh, uh, Afghans were talking to Taliban, when there was the whole world was talking to Taliban, uh, and thinking that it might be a potential power, and everybody knew about it. So I think that there have been several opportunities. We have seen India being present at various major events. But today, just now, there is a report coming. I have not seen it. It's just come. I was asked to comment also. I refused because I was not so sure. But we have heard that, Mr. Stanikzai, he has been one of the key interlocutors in Doha, and he has been trained in India as well. And there are several others who might have good. When I talk to several of our army friends, I know that many of them are there. So there has been some kind of a discussion. We don't know if it's not political dialogue, but today's you must see the UN Security Council statements. The two of the three statements that came out on this, in none of them India had mentioned word Taliban in this, and I think that was a good way to look at it, because see, you have to deal with the reality, and we have also dealt with in our neighborhood with all the crook generals. So I don't see if we want to just give to the Afghanistan, in my view, to the Sino-Pak axis totally, then it is a different thing. Otherwise, if we consider that we are going to just not help them, and if they are looking to, because see the statements Taliban has made in the recent past, of course, nobody trusts them. T of Taliban, T and trust are two things which are very much apart. But if the way they are trying to project themselves as some kind of a face which is more reasonable and rational, and as far as India is concerned, the statements that we have seen in recent past, and more importantly on Kashmir, I think that they are the lesser of the other evils that exist there, including the one which is on our western borders.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rubin, would you like to comment on it?
I'll largely decline to comment on it because I'm not Indian, and so I don't want to suggest what India would do. All I would say is with North Korea, the United States has always had a channel of communications, for example, so that bodies can be returned after floods wash people across the DMZ and so forth. And there's a huge difference between that and a much more broad strategic dialogue. But beyond that, let me defer to my Indian colleagues on the panel.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Gautam, would you like to say anything?
Yes, thank you. Actually, I more or less made my comments on that. I'll just add that, of course, I think the contacts, the discrete contacts that we had with the Taliban probably actually helped us in our evacuation process. So I would not minimize the role of a kind of pragmatic engagement, but as I said, a pragmatic engagement that can extend to, somehow keeping the people to keep the relationship alive. The people should of the government, so that is there. But I would also say that definitely short of legitimation and definitely not recognition. But unfortunately, the way I see the UN Security Council statements coming up, the role of the Taliban as a kind of destabilizing or terrorist or an invading group, in fact, just does not appear. Progressively, this has disappeared. The latest resolution does not talks about the Taliban as a state actor, virtually as a state actor. So I think I see the world going in a completely different way. And again, I sort of refer back to Mr. Alexander. We should not forget that in this year alone, the Taliban's atrocities have included attacks against hospitals, attacks against girls' schools, attacks against minorities verging on genocide, including a killing of about 14 Hazaras the other day, of the Hazaras in particular. Of course, as other people described, attacks against civil society activists, against media people, including an Indian, and in the latest stage, abductions and forced marriages with women under some kind of religious sanction. So I think these are some of the reasons for which the ISIS was bombed in Iraq and Syria. And talking about the invasion, These are some of the reasons why the US and the world intervened against Iran vis-a-vis Kuwait. And it is really astonishing to see the whole world actually give a pass to this and deal with deputy leaders and spokespersons and receive them in the chancelleries of the world, and for the director of the CIA to actually meet a deputy leader of this organization in Kabul. You know, we may have to live with certain realities, but I think certain betrayals cannot be forgotten. And the biggest betrayal of this is the betrayal of the United States and the West, which the Afghan people will not forget. The second great betrayal is that of the Afghan government, to be very truthful, because they let down their people. And there are more betrayals coming up. And I hope that we don't join that particular bandwagon.
Thank you, sir. Abhinav, would you like to say something?
I more or less agree with what Ambassador Mukhopadhyay said. I mean, definitely I see a sense in pragmatic engagement, but certainly not some kind of a formal recognition and providing legitimacy. But yes, we have to be guarded and mindful of the fact that I mean, GHQ Rawalpindi is the is the entity which really controls Taliban, and I mean, we have some conflicting interests. So I mean, so these things we have to keep in mind. Otherwise, I mean, pragmatic engagement has to be there always. Thank you.
Asija, just one point, and we should not forget that the Islamic Republic is still alive in Panjshir, at least at this moment, headed by its vice president. This should not be lost sight of. It still exists. Today the issue of recognition will come to the United Nations. There is a past precedent to this. During 1996-2001, Professor Ustad Rabbani continued to be the president of the legitimate government of Afghanistan.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, a senior European leader has called the withdrawal from Afghanistan as the biggest debacle that NATO has suffered since its founding. How do you see America's US allies in NATO getting their policies in the aftermath of the Taliban takeover? Can the EU, the NATO, or the wider world standing up for democracy afford to give up on Afghanistan? I think we'll start with Dr. Rubin, though I see that he's already sent us a link of his recent article. But if you would like to make a brief comment, sir.
Yes, NATO should be very, very worried. The mood which allowed both the Trump administration and the Biden administration to unilaterally pull the carpet out from underneath Afghanistan and do so without the promised coordination with our NATO allies isn't going to go away. When I lecture at universities, as I usually make a debate circuit every semester, I was recently, I believe, at Ohio State University, and the person with whom I was debating asked the crowd of around 200 students, how many of you would be willing to die for Estonia? And 2 hands went up. I mean, there is a growing isolationist trend in the United States, and at the same time, our educational emphasis, even among the elites, has not kept up with the notion that these security arrangements are collective security arrangements, American navel gazes, and historically we've forgotten many of the lessons of the past. I should also note that every generation of policymakers, even though we don't discuss it, is shaped by world events in which they grew up. And we're now at a point in the United States where many of the policymakers in Congress, people like Jake Sullivan in the National Security Council, don't remember the Cold War. They have no personal memory of that. And that also shapes the manner in which a newer generation of Americans react. At the very least, I would expect NATO to be tested. And I'm not sure whether the United States will do the right thing, either with the Baltics or outside of NATO with countries like Taiwan.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Alexander, would you like to make a brief comment on the same? Are you still with us, Mr. Alexander?
I'm still here.
Yeah, thank you.
So yes, thank you for the opportunity, Hazija. I agree very much with Michael's points. This is and those made by the other speakers on the previous question. This should be of deep concern to NATO and to all who are in alliance or see themselves in a strategic partnership with the United States. But again, I think it's helpful if we take the answer from where we've rightly focused it for the purposes of today's discussion: events in and around Afghanistan, the changing geopolitical dynamic that they will drive, and the threats arising from the Taliban, Islamic State, and other Pakistani proxies, to this larger issue of what Pakistan has been actually doing. They have been fighting. They are in many respects the pioneers of today's form of hybrid war. And by hybrid war, I mean information warfare, using the very potent, weaponizing the very potent tools now available to states via social media and all the digital platforms on which we depend. Information warfare combined with economic levers, the course of diplomacy that can go with those economic levers, and the military irregular and regular use of force, intelligence operations, influence operations in their harder forms, and so forth. Pakistan has been developing this pattern and this capacity for hybrid warfare for 50 years. One might argue that the Soviet Union were masters of it before that. But I would argue in the 20th century that Pakistan has had the most success because they have enjoyed this enormous impunity, getting away with invasion, systematic backing of terrorist groups without any unified response from the international community. But alongside Pakistan, and especially in the last 10 years, we have Russia, increasingly China, and also Iran, who have become not just practitioners of hybrid warfare, but masters of it. And one of the goals of hybrid warfare is to, according to the tenets of Sun Tzu's treatise, to make your enemy unready to fight before you even press the start button on a conflict. And the isolationism, which was probably already rising in the United States and other Western countries even before 2011, has been amplified, magnified, and worsened by the practice of hybrid warfare, mostly by Russia, but increasingly by these countries acting in concert, because it creates a strategic space for them to pursue their objectives. It has systematically weakened almost across the board democracies, freedom of speech in most parts of the world, and the global economic system that was underpinned by those democracies and their trading systems, their courts, and so forth, is in a bit of trouble today because of all of that. So let's not forget that there is a direct relationship, not just between NATO and Afghanistan, not just through the mission that has now ended in disaster, but through this larger issue of the willingness of democracies to pursue their national interests properly, consistently, and their willingness to work together as allies and partners.
Thank you, sir. We do have more questions, but as we are running out of time, I'm really sorry we will not be able to address it. I'd like to invite Mr. Abhinav Pandya to give the closing remarks and a vote of thanks.
First of all, I would like to extend my warmest thanks and regards to all the esteemed panelists who joined us today for this event. Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin, Ambassador Trigunayat, Christopher Alexander, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, Meena ji. Thank you very much. Okay, so all your views have been absolutely enlightening for us, on a topic which is so critical today and is defining the geopolitical trends which we are going to see in the future. But with this, definitely this event adds a lot of value to the discourse going on this particular subject in India. And we had such a cross-sectional and a wide variety of opinions and expertise on this subject that, I mean, we are really thankful to you for this. Okay? And hope to see you in one of our future events in the near future. Thank you.